Well, hello, class. I am your professor today, Professor Alex. Now, I know I sure look a lot like your young, handsome minister who's usually up here on Sundays, but don't worry, I assure you, you're all in the right place. You've all successfully enrolled in our intro course here at UUCGT, Spiritual Practices 101. For some, talking about spiritual practices can seem a bit like something mysterious or magical. For others, it can bring up past memories and experiences of more traditional things, like praying, chanting, and meditating, perhaps things done in church, with family, or with friends. Now, don't worry, this is just an introductory level class. There's no pop quiz or exam today, though I do hope you all remembered your homework. Just kidding. There are likely people with all sorts of backgrounds and relationships to spiritual practices in our midst. Some of you may have been raised with certain traditions, like praying before a meal, lighting candles for the Sabbath, or some other ritual. And others of you may have come into spirituality at a later part in your life. You've developed your own practices and traditions that you can't imagine your life without. And I'm sure that there are also many of you who are skeptical about spiritual practices. Don't you have to be pretty spiritual for that? I'm really not all that spiritual or religious. Praying and meditating really just isn't my thing. Now, before you zone out from this class, I'd encourage you to think about spiritual practices a little bit differently. Perhaps there are spiritual practices you do that you haven't yet even realized. Maybe you might add a practice or two that helps you to deepen your life experience a little bit deeper and dig into what spirituality means in your case. So I invite you to get comfy, to sit back, and let's delve into this world of spiritual practices together. And let's start by even just talking about what a spiritual practice is. Our teaching assistant for this course, Mary Ann, shared with you a reading from our syllabus. One of the key parts to understanding spiritual practice is understanding what we mean by spirituality itself. Many thinkers and teachers have taken a stab at this question in several different ways. In Buddhist traditions, spirituality involves a movement and transition from delusion to enlightenment, moving from living your life asleep to living life fully awake. In Islam, one understands spirituality as a way of surrendering to the will of God, of moving from a place of spiritual death to a place of life. A way that you live out life in honoring God's teachings to love and to live for one another. And more famously to some of you, the Transcendentalist and New England Unitarian, Henry David Thoreau, described spirituality in this way. In Thoreau's words, "I went to the woods because I wished to live deliberately, to front only the essential facts of life and see if I could not learn what it had to teach, and not, when I came to die, discover that I had not lived. I did not wish to live what was not life. Living is so dear." For Thoreau, spirituality involved living deliberately, taking only the important and essential in life and not getting bogged down in all that other stuff to where someone might miss the whole point of living. In Thoreau's practice, retreating to the woods around Concord's Walden Pond to write, think, and reflect, this allowed him to wrestle with some of these deeper questions that we're sharing this morning. It allowed him time and space to experience life in greater and newer depths. And because of this practice, he was able to live deliberately. Pay close attention to this word as we discuss more about what makes a spiritual practice. Many of us do not have the luxury of retreating to the privacy of the woods in our daily lives. We don't have the abilities to unplug from our busy digital world, to find the space to calm and center ourselves amidst our already stacked full lives. And thankfully, you don't need to live like Thoreau, way out there in the woods, away from everybody else, in order to live more spiritually and deliberately. Spiritual practices themselves are a form of spiritual centering that you can turn to and retreat to at times, even in an already full and busy life. Don't believe me? Take one of my examples. Each morning when I get up to make a cup of coffee, I do a centering practice of saying 5 things that I am grateful for that day. This isn't a long or exhaustive practice. It might only add a minute or 2 to my morning, but overall it adds so much more than just an extra minute to my day. For me, it really brings things back into perspective with what really matters. Even on a morning where my thoughts are racing, when I think of all those things that I have to do that day or the little chores or tasks that I have to accomplish before I can head out the door, somehow this small, simple practice makes all of that melt away. And for a minute, I am centered and present. I am more fully awake to my life and the things that bring my life blessing. So now that you know that not all spiritual practices are long or super time-consuming, let's talk specifically about what makes a spiritual practice. Remember that word that Thoreau used, deliberately. A spiritual practice is something that is both deliberate and intentional. This aligns with our theme of living with intention for soul matters this month. It's something that you make time for to do in your day, no matter how big or how small. A spiritual practice is something someone does with attention. Something like walking the dog every day is a great example. On the one hand, walking the dog can be an excellent spiritual practice. Taking the dog out, noticing the fresh chill on your face, smelling the crispness of the air, feeling alive in walking and moving your body. Though on the other hand, it might not be a spiritual practice. The moment it just becomes something routine without any attention or intention, it stops being a spiritual practice. Walking the dog for the sake of walking the dog is not a spiritual practice. Though walking the dog with deliberate mindfulness, with an intention to connect with something both within and beyond yourself, is a spiritual practice. Believing in God or having a particular spirituality is not required to live deliberately. All that is required is that you do it with deep and meaningful intention. Building on this point, actually doing spiritual practice, another required part of practice is both routine and rhythm. Spiritual practices are what they are because they require the discipline of actually doing them. For something to become a spiritual practice, it takes the intentional time to actually practice it. The actual rhythm of these practices might vary. Some of these might be something you do every day, like walking the dog. Others, like seeing an old friend for a cup of coffee, or enjoying a nice dinner with your partner or loved one, might be weekly or monthly. The only catch is that doing any of these things too little to where they lose their deliberateness or meaning, that can harm their impacts on your life. Like in music, practicing before the performance is everything, even practicing on days when you just don't feel like it, moments when you really don't want to have to go walk the dog. A spiritual practice is an investment of time. It's setting a particular rhythm that you can return to again and again, and something that doesn't fully develop if you don't actually put the time in to practice it. There's a whole field of spiritual practices before you that you might consider taking up. As Marianne, our teaching assistant, shared, there are 8 sorts of practices that you can delve into. Spiritual or personal practices, communal practices with others, partnership practices with one other person, both mind and body practices, soul practices, family practices, and even justice practices that help to heal the world. Across these 8 different categories, there are a plethora of practices that you might do that fit into one or more of these different categories. For example, a weekly meditation or study group might be both a mind and also a communal practice. Taking the time to center yourself and make art or music every day might be both a personal practice and also a soul practice. Making a point to attend a rally or protest once a month, a justice practice, might also be one that you do with your family or your partner. Even something as basic as enjoying a cup of coffee each morning can be a practice that moves both the mind and the soul. So what ideas of practices come to your mind when you think of all of these different areas? Mind, body, soul, personal, partnership, communal, justice, family? Think of one thing you already do that might fit into one of these categories. Something that you might approach with deeper intention and deliberateness. And once you've grasped that, think about a practice that you might add instead. Something you haven't yet tried, but that you might do and might be willing to put a little more time and attention into for reflecting and thinking spiritually. So, class, let's review what we've learned together. Spirituality itself is a process of living more fully into life, of experiencing life by being both more aware and more awake. Spiritual practices are practices that help us to experience this in our full and busy lives. They help us to stop, to slow down, and to remember ultimately what really matters. But spiritual practices aren't free. They require both deliberateness and rhythm. Your spiritual practices don't have to be the stereotypical or traditional practices that we all know and think of, like praying or meditating. They don't even have to take hours and hours of practice. Whatever you do, whether walking the dog or even brushing your teeth, this can be a spiritual practice as long as you do it with enough practice and intention. When I first set out to start a spiritual practice, I remember thinking that this sounded quite silly for my own life. I'm really not that spiritual of a person, and meditating every day or praying just doesn't work for me. I doubted that spiritual practices made sense for me in my own life's rhythms. Now, as I look back after years of cultivating these practices, years of journaling my thoughts, of listening and playing music, of going on long and deliberate walks through nature, the more that I can't imagine my own life without them. When I don't do these things, I stop feeling fully like myself. My day feels off, something about my life feels unbalanced and uneasy. More importantly, I stop feeling connected to that gentle place of both mystery and wonder within myself and also all around me. I stop living in a way that I can experience life in its fullness, in a way that I can be more present to both others and myself through all that life brings. In the end, spiritual practices aren't just for ministers or monks. They aren't just for devout believers or spiritual teachers. They are for everyone and anyone who seeks to live life in its depth. And in the process, you might realize that these practices carry with them way more than you could ever have imagined. Well, I think we've covered enough for today, but your homework for when you leave is to explore and experiment with spiritual practices. Try something new, something that moves your body, that inspires your soul, that gets your minds moving and stirring. Return to something that you already enjoy doing with a deeper mindfulness and intention. Don't worry, I won't be checking your practices or seeing if you've been keeping up with them. We all have days when we miss our routines and our rhythms. To close, I hope you find some way, as Thoreau tells us, to live life deliberately so that you don't let life pass you by. Living is so dear. Go in peace, everyone. Class dismissed. May it be so, and amen.